Hey everybody, welcome to the First Million Words. I'm Ben.
And I'm Guillermo.
And I just wanted to record really quickly and just get it out of the way because the interview we did with Michael J. Sullivan that you're going to listen to in this episode went a little longer. I try to keep our episodes between like 30 to 45 minutes, and this is going to be a long episode, so I just wanted to let you know there won't be any, witty, fun conversation between Guillermo and myself at the end of the show. We'll save that for next week.
Yes, so join us next week for Stuff
and things.
And junk.
So everybody enjoy the episode where we interview Michael J. Sullivan. We had a lot of fun, and Guillermo's back from Boston. No, wait, you didn't go to Boston. You went to D.C.
Yes.
Why did
DC.
I say Boston?
I don't know.
Same general area, I guess, but...
No.
Sorry, I guess I got Boston on the mind because I'm wicked stupid. I don't know.
No, mostly because the Capitals knocked them out of the playoffs.
Oh, take that, Boston team that I don't know in hockey. Okay.
Yes, because I was once from there. I take credit for everything that hockey team does, even though, like, they don't issue me a jersey. I have to buy one.
I'm the same with Chicago, which is kind of bittersweet sometimes. So. All right, remember fmwpodcast.com. Leave us comments, listen to the show, listen to us on iTunes, and leave some comments and some stars. And also Ryira.com. That's RIYRIA.com from Michael Sullivan's website. He has the books Theft of Swords, I always get them mixed up. Theft of Swords, Rise of Empire, Heir of Navarone. So download those, or read them, buy them, whatever you got to do to consume them. So,
everything, just make sure you pay for it.
Yeah, pay for it, of course, yeah.
Because then if you don't pay for it, then we go hungry, and then, well, not we, I mean, like I had him. Well, because he was on the podcast, I take credit for, just like I do in sports. No, I don't. That was all MJS.
Yes. All right. So check out his website. He's got fun blogs for writing advice. And go there, check it out, and we'll see you next week. The First Million Words, Episode 6, an interview with Michael J. Sullivan.
Rye as in the grass, ear as in the corn, and
okay. Too many syllables. That's it. Yeah. So I just wanted to say, I heard about your books. I believe it was either, I want to say Dead Robot Society or Adventures in Sci-Fi Publishing. A while ago, and you were mentioning how you just got picked up by Orbit.
So you've been listening to podcasts.
Oh yeah. That's
you and two other guys.
Yeah. Exactly, and we're hoping to get those other guys listening to our show too.
I see. Okay.
So and that's the shows like that though. Dead Robot Society, Adventures in Sci-Fi Publishing, and Writing Excuses, and then combine those with the Nerdist podcast, because those are like my main ones I listen to, and that's what made me want to start doing this show. Was I really wanted to have one with writers, doing kind of a little get to know you interview, and then a few spots of, like talking shop.
Right.
So it's going to be like 4 weeks devoted to each author that we interview. So you'll be all of May.
Wow, I'll own a whole month, and it's a good month too.
Yeah, it is. It is. I think you have. I was looking up on Amazon. You have a new book coming out pretty soon?
No.
I saw... Okay, wait. Let me see. What did Amazon tell me? It was...
Oh, come on, Ben. You know better than to trust Amazon.
Yeah. Well, anyway, I heard you on those other podcasts, and then I added The Crown Conspiracy to my Goodreads list as to read.
Right.
And then I got a message from you that said, "Hey, thanks for adding that." So I was like, "That's, that kind of makes me want to read the book even more."
And you finally did.
Yeah. Oh yeah. It took me a while to get the Crown Conspiracy, just because I had this other this list I wanted to get through before I got an ebook or an e-reader, and then I bought when Theft of Swords came out. That was like one of the first books I got on the Kindle, and then I reread Theft of Swords and then like the second and third book I just flew through. Like I finished those about a week ago.
Yeah, I saw you had a post on Goodreads where you had the two books, Rise of Empire and Heir of Narvan, on there pictured, and you had a 5-star, but no comment, just a straight 5 stars.
Yeah, I haven't put a review up yet because I like to take my time.
You were going to wait to talk to me to see if I was an asshole before you decided to write. And if I was, you were going to completely trash me, which I understand.
Yeah, I'd be like, oh, this book sucks.
It's like, but he did give us some really awesome writing tips, so.
But here it says Antithesis and A Burden to the Earth say they're coming out in early June. Is that not correct?
No, they have no idea what they're talking about.
Oh, okay.
Burden to the Earth is a book that I wrote a long time ago, and it was the last book I wrote before I gave up writing, which was back in the early 90s. Mm-hmm. And I was going to give that, basically it was in a drawer for forever. It was the best book I thought I ever wrote. So it wasn't until just recently that I thought, well, maybe I should try and put that out. But the problem with that is nothing like the Rhaegar Revelations at all. It's completely different in style and tone and subject. It's not fantasy. It's very realistic, and it's completely contemporary literature. It's very, I mean, the prose in it is very complex, and the story is extremely simple, and it's kind of depressing. So it's not at all like my other stuff. So if I were to publish that, everyone who read, the other books would be like, what the hell is this?
Yeah. You said you wrote that and then kind of gave up on it. What number book was that for you? Because I know you wrote several books before.
Yeah, that would have been about I think 12. That was the 12th book I wrote.
Wow.
The 13th was Crown.
Wow, and then that was the one that.
Yeah, I completely gave up after writing what I thought was like the great American novel, and I didn't think I could ever do better than that. And it's a really well-written book. But when I got done with it, I thought, this is fantastic. And I sent it off to the agent, and the agent came back and said, this can never be published. And I said, well, why? And she said, well, first of all, it's got a male antagonist or male protagonist, and women don't read about male protagonists, and men don't read about anything other than courtroom thrillers or something with wartime drama or something, or sports. They're not going to read this. Yeah. So they said there's no market for it. I'm like, well, great, because that's all the kind of books I write. It has male protagonists, and I'm not writing those other stories. So I gave up. I said, well, after I think at that point it had been about 10 years of straight nonstop writing, and I just gave up. I said, well, I'm never going to get anywhere. And all my friends had, they'd gone to college, and I had one friend who became a professor, for God's sakes, and he was starting as a professor, and the guy had started a successful business, and another person had managed to get up to the district manager, and here I was still in the exact same position I was when I left high school.
Wow.
So I was like, wow, yeah, I've got to kind of give this dream up.
And is that what like how long after that did you get back into it?
Well, like I said, it was about 12 years later, because what I did was I left, because I started out in art. I could do two things when I got out of school. I was creative in writing, although I couldn't spell and I didn't know anything about grammar. And the other thing I did was I drew, and I did paintings, and both of those were both recognized as being things I had a talent for. And I had a scholarship for an art school, so I went into commercial art for about a year. Then I ran out of money off the scholarship. I was very poor as a kid. I mean, my father was a World War II veteran, and he had veterans benefits after he died when I was 9 years old. He was a crane operator at Great Lakes Steel, so we never had a lot of money. And when he died, we had virtually nothing other than the veteran benefits and Social Security that we lived off of. So I couldn't go to college, and then I started working full time, and then I didn't have time to go to college, and so I didn't get anywhere with that. I did manage to get a job. I went to community college and kept taking art classes, nothing but art classes. I didn't actually take any curriculum or anything. And then I went and I started a job as an illustrator, as an entry-level illustrator, and I did pretty well, but I was making minimum wage. And then my wife graduated from her college, and she's really smart. I don't know if you've talked to her. Most people have met her. Who come to me usually come to me through her first. Yeah. And she actually is a genius, and she was a valedictorian of her high school class, and she got a great career, and she got one of the top 3 people to graduate her college in an engineering degree. So when she got a job, I didn't have to work anymore because the amount of money that I made barely paid for the gas to get me to work and back, and she was making 10 times what I was making. So I said, well, screw it, I'm just going to stay home and I'll watch the kids so she can work. And then I started writing because I had nothing else to do, so I would just write, and that's what I did for 10 years. Well, then after I quit, we moved to Raleigh, North Carolina from Vermont, where I was practicing my writing in the middle of a snowbound cabin type deal. So I went to North Carolina. I went to Raleigh, and at that time, I had learned also, in addition to writing, I also played with computers because obviously computers were new, and they had something called Photoshop, which was kind of new when I first started playing with it. I think I had Photoshop 1.
Oh, wow.
And back then, you didn't have any tools hardly at all. I remember when they came out with the cloning tool was like godsend. It was like, wow, this is fantastic. So I had developed certain skills with that and some other programs. So I actually went back in the art world, and I worked very briefly. I think it was for 1 year at a software company as basically their marketing department and advertising department. And then I realized I could do better than that. So I started my own company. I started my own advertising agency. And I hired my wife to be my president.
Good choice.
Yeah, so she went out and got all my clients, then I did all the work. And we did extremely well. For 12 years, we made lots of money. Of course, a lot of people did during that time. Mm-hmm. And we built a wonderful company. We had a nice little house on a beach, and we were doing really wonderful. And then I got really tired of doing the same thing over and over and over. I did the same brochures and trifolds and logos, and it wasn't creative for me anymore. It was kind of monotonous, and I wanted to do something creative again, but I couldn't write because I couldn't bring myself to write anymore because I spent so many years writing novels, spending a year of my life writing a novel, then just putting it in a drawer and having no one ever read it. It was really depressing for me. But my daughter, she went and was having trouble reading. She has dyslexia, and she was having all kinds of trouble. So I thought I'd get her something to read, and I went and I picked up this book called Harry Potter. And
I've heard of it.
You've heard of it. I think a couple people have. And it was sitting on a desk in front of me, and I was bored one day, so I picked it up and started reading it. And while I had been trying to learn how to write, what I did was I read what I thought were the best books I could read so I could learn from my writing, or from reading. And I was reading things like John Updike. I was reading all the Pulitzer Prize-winning novels and all the Nobel Prize-winning novels, the great, great works to try and figure out and absorb from them what they were doing. It was so wonderful.
Yeah,
and I
classics.
I hated reading. The stuff was just not interesting. I mean, it was well written, sure, but it was boring. Mm-hmm. And I didn't enjoy it. I picked up Harry Potter and I went, this is a blast. And I had the most fun I've had reading since I was a kid when I had been reading The Lord of the Rings. And I was like, this is fun. I went, well, screw it. I'm just going to sit down and I'm going to write a story that my daughter can read that is just going to be fun. I'm not going to try and make it great. I'm just going to make it enjoyable to read. I'm going to make it to be the kind of book that I would like to sit down and read. So at the same time, I was watching television, and I was watching a television show called Babylon 5. And I was amazed by the idea that Sikorsky, I believe his name is, Michael Sikorsky, he wrote the entire 5-year story arc of that show before the first show aired. And what that allowed him to do was allowed him to have events happen in the very early portion of the first season that would dramatically affect later seasons. Mm-hmm. So that you could watch it and go, I know this is going to mean something. I know, and you can kind of guess at what's going to happen next. And I thought all television shows should do that. Because so many times you get, particularly like you get a show like Lost, and you see these great things like, oh, I wonder how they're going to explain this. And then you realize that they're making this up as they go.
Yeah, it's like they never intended to explain it.
Yeah, they're just not going to explain it. Yeah.
Which ruins it for you, because you're thinking, you're taking notes going, this is going to be so great.
Yeah. And the polar bear,
yeah, exactly. I'm still trying to figure out the polar bear.
It's like, it is whatever you think it is. That's the ending. And I'm like, wait, what?
So that was my big problem. And I thought television shows should do that. And I actually thought he had started a trend that the success of the story was or his show was going to be this big new thing. And I thought, this is where all of television is going to go. And then, of course, reality TV came along and ruined everything.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, there is on that note, I agree. I love shows that do that. There's this one it was on Nickelodeon, and it was Avatar: The Last Airbender.
Yes.
That is amazing.
Okay.
Oh, yeah, it's part-
I've seen some episodes of that, and I actually saw the movie, which you probably hate.
Oh, well, when I saw the movie, I hadn't seen the series, and I saw the movie, and I liked it a lot. But
I actually did like it. No one else liked it. My family, everyone said, "You've got to be kidding me." I said, "No, watch it. Just watch it." And it's like it's not bad. It's not great, but it's not bad.
I felt that way too, because we went and saw it in 3D, and it's a beautiful looking movie. But
Well, the thing was, I saw the reviews. I was looking at the Rotten Tomato reviews, and it got like an abysmal 25% or something less.
Yeah.
And I went, it can't be that bad. And so I was expecting it to be horrible, and I was actually very entertained.
oh yeah. I mean, going back and watching it now after I've seen the series, I'm kind of like, oh, this is bad compared to the series. But
Well, I think that was the problem because people saw the series and then they had certain expectations about, this, they were expecting the sort of character development that, unfolded over, one series, wanted to condense that into 2 hours?
Yeah.
And it just didn't work. They had to change the characters a little bit, and it didn't, because I saw it before. I mean, I saw the regular show before the movie, and I was like, this is wrong. But yeah, if I hadn't seen it before, it would have been really cool. I wish I had seen the movie first and then the show. But
yeah.
Yeah, that tends to be how I got the impression too. If you looked at the reviews, all of them were one of two camps. Either there were people who would normally never watch that kind of show ever anyway, and the other camp are the people who loved the original series and then therefore despised the movie. But no one listed reviews having come to it completely originally and had an open review of it. So, but so I when I got it, I watched that show. I thought to myself, if I was and this is a time when I was bored. And I find that writers do their best when they're bored. Any creative person, when you get them really bored, that's when they do some really great stuff.
Especially bored and unchallenged.
Yes, and have lots of time on your hand.
Yeah.
Put those together and you can have Mona Lisas appear. So I was thinking about this and I thought, would it be cool if I could make a television show where I would design it? How would I do it? If someone came to me as a producer and said, I want you to make a television show and I'll pay all the money you want and I'll get everything, well, that would be cool. What would I do? And I thought, well, I would probably do something that's never been done before to my satisfaction, which would be to have a medieval fantasy television show that's good. And I can't even think of too many attempts at it.
Yeah, and even now there's there's pretty much the one.
Which one's the one?
Game of Thrones?
Oh no, I'm talking about a regular network television show.
Oh.
Weekly with series, an episode, as opposed to an HBO series because you have Rome and they're very different from a regular television show. But I mean the closest thing I could think of is Xena or something like that.
Oh yeah, and they did what was that one that was Legend of the Seeker? I never saw that, but
I haven't seen that either, but I did hear about that one. But there was the idea is that at the time, the only television show I liked there was something about ancient Ireland, which was actually pretty well done. It only lasted a season. But that was kind of interesting. But I thought if you did the same kind of thing as Karski did with Babylon 5, that would have been great. And so I started thinking of how I would do that. And I would think that you'd want to start off with a very small, simple pair of characters like two thieves and I came up with the idea of them climbing a tower to steal a sword. And when they get there, they find the dead body of the king, and then boom, the whole series takes off from that point. And you get involved in this complex conspiracy, and as you go through the episodes, very slowly you begin to learn more and more about these characters. You don't want to give it to them all up front, because then there's nothing to give you later on. So you want to slowly dole out background information on these characters. And I thought, that would make a great thing. And then the idea was to have a main plot that happens in the early portion of the story. So you have a mystery that you are trying to figure out. And then there's a longer plot that takes maybe a season to get through, and then a longer one. So that as one ends, another one's already beginning. So you're always interested in what's going to happen, just the same way that Babylon 5 had done. That's what I thought of. And I thought, well, that's what I'll do. So I started thinking about that, and I realized I couldn't do it because I don't know anyone in television. But then I thought, well, I could write that. And in fact, if I wrote a book series, it would be like seasons. Each novel would be like in a complete season. So they're huge episodes. And I went, well, that's what I'll do. And I intended to do this with no intention of ever publishing it. There was no chance I was going to get this published because I had tried and I knew I couldn't. So what I was going to do is I was just going to write them. And for the hell of it, I was just going to put them on the internet for free. I was going to make a website and just stick them out there. Anyone who wanted to could download them. And I did that for the first 3 books. And I think no one ever read them. I don't know why.
That's yeah, that's hard to.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so absolutely no one ever saw them, and no one made comments on them. So I kind of gave up on it. But I gave it to my daughter, and I said, "You should read this because I kind of wrote this for you." And she says, "Well, that's great." She says, "But being dyslexic, she has these really weird quirks. Like she has to have the door to her room closed, and she has these really weird things that just drive her crazy." She says, "But I can't read it in manuscript form. You need to get it published."
Oh,
So I'm
okay.
like, oh, why didn't I think of that?
Yeah,
Huh?
duh.
So I came up with an ingenious plan. I went to my wife and I wrote a cover letter to an agent. And in this cover letter, I said, "Well, here, hon, look this over and see what you think. I'm going to send out this one today." And she looked at it and she read it and she says, "Just get out of the way. You're a moron, because you don't send out one, and you're sending out to a random person.
Yeah.
And this could be so much better." And I did the exact same thing once too when I was making dinner. She wanted me to make dinner, so I took those crescent rolls you buy at the store, then the roll, and you hit it on something and it pops open. And I took that and I set it on a cookie tray and I put it in the oven. But I think my big mistake was you're supposed to unroll it.
It can't just be one big. Yeah.
Yeah. And she just couldn't believe it. She's never asked me to bake since those days.
Yeah. I think your wife and my wife have a bit in common. My wife's kind of the same thing with, I'll be cooking dinner and she's like, "Move."
Yes.
Yeah.
And so this was all master plan of mine. So after I got done with that, she took over. And within about 3 months, she got me an agent. And that agent started taking it around and eventually got picked up by AMI, which is a small publisher in Minnesota. And they had it out for a year. Didn't do all that well. I mean, for a very small published book, it did okay. And they actually sold out their first printing, but they didn't have enough money to print Avanpartha, and they didn't have enough money to do a reprint of Crown. So I was actually able to buy back the rights to both those books.
Oh, and at that point, when you sent out the letter and had them published through that company, you already had all the rest of the 6 books written?
Yeah, I had written the entire series. I wrote Persepliquus, I think it was in 2007, Persepliquus in 2007. And I was finishing that up, and I was kind of depressed because I had written the Nephron Rising, the latter half of that, and I wrote Emerald Storm, Wintertide, and finally Persepliquus. And no one had read them. A number of people had read the first 3 books, including my wife, and they all said they liked it. And so I was all excited. I'm like, well, the next book is done, and no one read them. And I was so depressed. So in that winter, I was writing that Persepliquus, or Wintertide and Persepliquus, and I didn't think anyone was going to read these. And I told myself, I'm just going to get through them. I just want to finish the story. And the reason I wanted to is because I was afraid that one day I was going to be dead. And I pick these books up and start reading them, and she would just go, "Oh my God, these are so great," and they're not done.
Yeah.
And I didn't want her to be stuck not knowing, because I knew if you read the end of the books, it changes the whole. I mean, you get a whole different view of the whole books, because the very end really makes everything else make much more sense.
Oh yeah.
And I didn't want to leave it off, and I had to make sure I got it done, because I was really depressed. I didn't think anyone was going to read them, but I thought I'm going to finish it just for the sake of having finished it. And as I was doing that, my wife would send out the first few books to general smaller publishers, and we didn't expect anything back from them. She wasn't even looking. She hadn't checked her mail for like 3 months in an email, and finally we found out on I think it was January 1st. It was New Year's Day. She happened to just check the email and found back in October we had someone say, "Yes, we'll sign a contract for that." And we went, "Really? Guess we should have checked that mail earlier."
Yeah.
So that's how it happened. I had them all done, and I had gone through it, and I had gone back and forth to make sure everything jived, and it was all precisely set up so I could do those fun things like Babylon 5 did.
Nice. Yeah. I love that about the series, how it was just this like one giant arcing story, and then the little stories in it, and it starts out so like personal with just the 2 guys, and then all of a sudden at the end, not to give anything away because Guillermo hasn't read it yet, but it's just this like world changing thing happening.
Yeah, when you get to the end of it, it's a little bit like Sixth Sense, where you suddenly go, "Oh my God!" And then if you start looking back, you start realizing that all the things that you saw weren't exactly what you thought they were at the time.
Yeah, and at the end it's like, oh, it all makes sense now.
Yes, and there's been a number of people who have gotten to the end now, and they said, "Oh, now I've got to go back and reread it."
Yeah, yeah. Again, not to give anything away, there was, I like how at the end I was just waiting, for that thing to happen at the very end.
Uh-huh.
And I, because I knew, I was like, who's it gonna be? Which person is gonna be, that? And
are you talking near the end or the very end?
Oh, like the very end.
Okay.
Yeah,
So you were expecting that one.
Yeah, the feather.
Right. Gotcha.
So but at the end, I just like, I was like, oh, who's it gonna be? Who's it gonna be?
Yeah, that was actually a mistake.
Oh.
My wife I had two people read the series originally, and they both got to the end of the book and they didn't understand it.
Oh.
So they said, you got to put more clues in for this. And I said, okay. So we ended up putting a little bit in each book, and it turns out that when you're having 6 books that are spanned by 6 months apart, it's okay. But when you put those books into omnibuses, you're like, then they start hitting you really fast, becoming overkill. And then you have people like you who are looking for the answer when they shouldn't even know there's a question.
Yeah. Well, that's I think
now the suspense is going to be killing me, man.
Yeah. And I also I had a question about like the writing style of the book, because you mentioned that your earlier stuff you were writing was very heavy into the the construction of it, the prose and putting it together. Okay. The language in these it's very it's casual, and it's not it's not that grand Tolkien and like everybody trying to be very formal. And I just wondered, was that like a conscious decision you made? Was to make it like that because you were writing it for your daughter? Was that something?
I had nothing to do with my daughter, but yes, it was extremely conscious. I have a theory, and my theory is that if you're writing a book that has a very complex story, I feel that it's better to write it in very simple prose, because you don't want to have the person having to fight through and somewhat translate what you're writing for them to get the meaning, because then you have complex on complex and people can easily get confused. Well, the other option, the opposite of that, is when you're writing a very simple story, then by virtue of making it have some weight, then you actually have to have better, more complex prose. And that's what I actually discovered when I was reading books for practice back during those 10 years when I was in Vermont, was when I would read books that were Nobel Prize-winning, beautiful prose-type style books, they had the simplest plots you could imagine. I mean, virtually nothing happens in these books, except a person spends his life, it's like 3 days of a guy doing virtually nothing, but it's very beautifully written.
Or you get the crying of Lot 49.
Yeah. I mean, it just virtually nothing happens, but it's very beautifully done. And I felt the same way. But I also felt that if you're going to be writing something that's complex, if you start putting a lot of heavy, complex wording, people have a problem with it. And the other thing I found is that when you read, for instance, Hemingway, who doesn't do that, he trims everything down very small. And what he does when one of the great effects that he discovered when he did that, and this is actually his words, I got done reading A Movable Feast where he explains this, was that when you trim it down, what happens is people read very easily and they kind of don't stop, because there's not, if it's very complex, you have to translate it. It's like if you're reading Shakespeare, you don't just like see and understand. You have to read it and go, oh, okay, what is he saying here? Okay. Yeah. And there's a slight slowdown where you're translating it. So the result of that is an intellectual process. Whereas if you have it very simple to where you're not thinking, it's more like watching a movie or hearing someone tell you a story, because it becomes instantly embedded into your mind, and you have an emotional response because you don't turn it off. When you're watching a film, a horror story, you don't get to stop reading. It just keeps coming at you. The music goes up, you see the blood, you see the action, and you're stuck because you're having this stuff jammed into your brain. And that's the kind of the effect of having simpler writing. When you have simpler writing, people don't get stuck. They don't read a sentence and not understand it and have to read it again. If I have a sentence where you don't understand it and you have to read it twice, that's a huge mistake on my part. And what I actually did was I would write sentences and I would have a slip where I would actually write something really good. I mean, eloquent. And I would actually have to take it out.
Oh.
because I didn't want someone read a sentence and go, "Oh, what an excellent sentence." Because if you ever notice my sentences, then I failed. Because I want you to only see the story. I want you to be in that story. I want you to see it happening behind your eyes. And I don't want you to be thinking about you reading a book at all. It should just be happening like a movie in front of your eyes. And to do that, it's actually quite difficult because you have to make sure you don't do anything that takes them out of the story. And it also happens, you can't write really badly either because, and I actually have one of my failings, I think, was that I did tend to use some repeated words, which when I reread it, it drives me crazy. Some like, how did I not see that? But those things that make you stop, that make you think that you're reading a book, whether they're good or bad, are the things I tried to get rid of, so that the story flowed in such a way that you were just lost in this other world with these other people, and then you had to wake up out of it. And that was the thing I was going through. And in doing so, hopefully I generated an emotional response in people so that they would laugh, so that they would cry, and rather than in many books that I have read, I mean, I love Isaac Asimov, but he's a very intellectual writer. And you think about it, oh, isn't that interesting? Not, oh my God, is he going to live? You don't have those kind of responses.
Exactly, yeah.
So since I was trying to do a very complex story and I wanted to have an emotional impact, that's why I wrote it in that style. Because yes, I've written in every style I can think of. I've written very complex. I've written very eloquently, very poetically. I've written like Stephen King. I've written like Philip Marlowe. I mean, I've written all kinds of different ways. And when I was practicing to see how people wrote those ways and why they wrote those, what effects did those do for the writing? And this is what I thought was best for these stories because it was a very complex story.
Yeah, well, it definitely worked because, just you bringing that up now, I'm like, oh, yeah, you're right. I never did stop to think like, oh, that was a very well put together sentence, because they just, they worked and it really kept you in the story.
Yeah, it's interesting because it's actually harder than it appears. I mean, if you read the stuff, it looks very simple, but in order to make it simple and yet flow with a certain melody to the words, it's not as easy as you might think. Sometimes being really simple is hard.
Yeah.
On the other side of that is the fact that if you were living in the age of Chaucer and you picked up a copy of Canterbury Tales, it wouldn't seem archaic or stilted or unusual. It would seem like you were reading the daily paper and you would get the jokes because the slang that's being used in that story would be your slang that you use in real life. So you wouldn't feel so separated. But when you read books that are written in that archaic, high-minded style, I feel that it separates you from the story because that's a different world. That's a world you're not used to. They purposely use terms that are different than Earth terms for the purpose of making you feel like you're visiting an alien place. I didn't want that. I wanted to have it so you're living in this place as if you had lived there your whole life, that you could be one of the characters in the story. Yeah, it's a slightly different setting, but these are people who you could know. These are people who could be your friends, and you could be riding around with these same people. And that was the kind of familiarity I wanted to give the reader so they could feel more immersion into the story, because I've always felt that when I was reading things like even Martin's stories, when I was reading George R. R. Martin's, I'm like, what's a Tsar?
Yeah.
I was totally lost. And there's so many references to things that I'm just like skipping along. Oh, I guess this will make sense at some point. And it was annoying. And it was very irritating for me to read that because it's like, why would you go to the effort of making things harder for the reader to understand? Because we already have terms for these things. Now, I understand, why a lot of people do that because they want to make their world sort of unique. But I mean, if we already have elves, if we already have, I mean, even my own editor said, well, instead of calling it a castle, wouldn't you call it something else so it's more unique and not so Anglo-Saxon? And I'm like, but everyone knows what a castle is. It's like, do I need to spend all that time describing something that we already know what it is? Yeah. And that just makes my work 10 times harder. If I were to actually go through and take the words out that were not appropriate to the time period, which doesn't exist, by the way, but if you were to assume that it was, say, 500 AD or even 1,000, most of the words, almost, I don't know how many of the words, you wouldn't be able to read it. Because most of the words that we have today were invented past that time.
Or adopted from
Well, Shakespeare invented 700 some odd words, which are many of the words we know today. So, I mean, there would be so few words in the English language that if I wrote it using only the words applicable to that time, you'd be totally lost.
Yeah,
so that's somewhat useless.
Yeah, that's why I keep telling myself, these aren't the Anglo-Saxons. This is a fantasy world, and you built it, so you get to decide how they talk.
Well, yeah, I was doing a talk at the Library of Congress just recently, and this came up, and I said, I think the reason why people invented fantasy as a genre to begin with was so that they didn't have to do research. In my world, my horses can run day and night for a week because they have lots of stamina because it's my world.
Yeah.
I can make it do whatever I want. And the people in my world use the word okay. Now, granted, I'm never going to have Royce turn to Hadrian and say, dude.
Yeah.
I mean, there are certain things I won't do. But it's like if you write, are either of you two writers?
Well, yeah, we're trying to be. We at this point, neither of us have finished a full book, so we've both kind of teamed up and started writing one together.
All right, well, then you might be able to appreciate this. But when you're writing, you can repeat certain words, but you can't repeat other ones. Like you can repeat the and is and it's and them, and no one is going to notice anything about it. But if you repeat the word paradigm, if you do that twice in a paragraph in a chapter, people will like, well, what the hell's with that? You can't think of another word. That's the kind of the thing. And if you're reading in fantasy and there are certain common words that people just take for granted, like the word okay. Now, that is a very modern term, but it's so prevalent to our modern day language that we don't think of that as being a modern word. So that you can get by with that one. But yeah, there are obviously certain ones that different people take offense to. Like you said, carte blanche, that's French. So you got like, okay, what was he thinking there, right?
Well, there's that little part of me that justified it because it was, it wasn't a person speaking. It was like part of the narration. So I was like, oh, okay, he can say that because it's narration.
But that also brings me to the point of profanity. And people have like said, oh, they love the fact that my books they don't have an excessive amount of sex. Or swear words or excessive violence. And they said, how nice it was that you decided to do this. And I was like, oh, I didn't really decide to do it that way. The reason I did it that way was quite simple. Is certain swear words I felt sounded way too modern. And I'm just like, these are the things you'd see in a cop show that was taking place in modern day. And I just can't imagine people back in the Middle Ages using these sorts of words. So what I did was I actually went up as many British slang swear words as I could find because those fit. You could say bloody, damn. You could say,
bugger.
You could say bugger. You could say codswallop.
Yeah.
These things sounded archaic, even though they're actually modern terms in Britain. So I actually found those to be my solution because I just couldn't bring myself to someone using the F word or anything like that, it just seems so gritty and modern urban that I thought it just seemed out of place.
Yeah.
So I didn't have those in there, but it wasn't an intention to make it PG or to make it, YA. I feel like the person that said, I wrote a child's book, not on purpose. Yeah. That wasn't my intention. Although it is nice that I did a lot of stupid things that actually turned out to be genius. I never intended for it to turn out that way, but it turns out that people have read my books, and then their children have picked them up, and they've read them, and they just love them, and now they have this whole family thing going on, and it's so great that I have a book that I can share with my mother and my daughter. And it's this is fantastic, and I'm like, if I had thought about that, I would have done it, but I never even considered it. It's a complete accident. Yeah. So who knows?
It's good that it spans that gap, and also back to swearing. The absence of vulgar language actually makes it. There's I think twice, and I can remember them clearly because they stand out. Is where Hadrian says "God damn it,"
yes,
and it really. Because there's no swearing up until that point, or no heavy swearing. It really kind of makes that have a bigger impact. It's like, oh, he must be serious.
Yeah, there were certain instances where the situation was so extreme that I couldn't get away without using some profanity, and I also did realize that if I kept it to a bare minimum, that when I did use it would be far more impactful.
Yeah, and also my biggest hang up on most fantasy novels is how they try to just totally replace swearing with, oh, I'm going to make up this word for it. And that happens in a sci-fi a lot with, frack.
Yes.
I can't stand that. But, and there's one, I love Brandon Sanderson. the book The Way of Kings is kind of the same way with you. I was very like into like, you know, kind of the classics and literary fiction, and it wasn't until a couple years ago that I started reading like more modern fantasy stuff. And there's that book The Way of Kings that Brandon Sanderson did, where he, you know, just says, you know, stormin' a lot. And he's like, oh, storm you and storm off. And, you know, I love the book, but I like every time I read that, I was like, oh, really?
The only time I did that was with when they used the gods' names in vain.
Yeah, that works. That works perfect. You know, the you know, Baimar and yeah. Which I love that meant hungry as well.
Oh yeah, right. But you won't. Don't explain that.
Oh yeah. I'm gonna. That's just that's some foreshadowing.
You're being crafty.
Yeah. And
Right.
well, if we're on the topic of language, how in depth did you go into to kind of make up the, you know, like the Elven and the Tenkan languages that are in there, because they don't really show up until a lot later.
Yeah, there's nothing to that at all.
Okay. Yeah.
The only thing I did with that was, I mean, I made up words and then, you know, like smashing my hand against the keyboard kind of thing. But then what I would do is when I was thinking in my head what the sentence would say, like the next one, if it had similar words, I did try to copy the same words, so you got an impression, if you were really paying attention, that it was kind of saying the same thing. But no, there is no language. I'm not a linguist. I'm not Tolkien. I don't know anything about that. And in fact, I had the audiobooks were recently done, and they called me up and they had me go over pronunciations of different words. And so they got to the first line of Elven, which I think it was in Alvin Partha. And he's like, you know, so how do you say this? I'm like, I have no idea.
You know,
I said, like, how would you say?
yeah, just make it up and we'll call it canon.
I said, you can go ahead and say it any way you want to. I said, you don't even have to look at the word. Just make up whatever you want. Because I never intended that to be a language.
Yeah.
But, you know, sometime somewhere in the future when HBO picks it up as a series, they'll have a linguist get together and actually invent a language.
There you go.
I've heard people have done that before.
Yeah. Guillermo and I are, you know, kind of the same way, where it's like, I really, you know, there's a lot of authors, you know, well, especially fantasy authors and, you know, sci-fi for alien languages, that they'll just, you know, get really hung up on creating a language and making the rules for it. And it's like, you know, nobody's going to read the whole book in that language.
Right.
You know, so just make it up as you go. That's fine.
Exactly. It's like I'm not making, you know, I'm not writing this book for some OCD like linguist to, you know, to sit there and pick apart and then complain on a blog about how the, you know, language is inconsistent.
Yeah, let them give you the 1 and 2 star reviews, and then everybody else can enjoy it.
Right.
Yeah, the only reason I had the language in there was it does play an important plot point, which I'm sure Benjamin understands, that the Elven words do have a key clue to part of the story, and that's why it's in there. Otherwise, I probably wouldn't have gone to even that much effort. But one of the things I intended to do, because I have pet peeves about modern fantasy, because like Ben was saying, that I started out reading Lord of the Rings, and then I couldn't find anything to replace it.
Yeah.
And I searched. This is back in the early 70s or mid 70s, and there was nothing out. I think the only book that came out, and it had just come out like a couple years later, was Ursula K. Le Guin's Earthsea trilogy. That was like the only other fantasy book that I thought had any merit at all. And then it wasn't until 79 when Terry Brooks came out with the Sword of Shannara that someone actually made a successful book. And I had read that one, but I felt that was just such a duplication of the original Lord of the Rings that it didn't thrill me. So I kind of left fantasy. I didn't read it anymore, and I went on to other things. I went to Stephen King and science fiction, and then eventually into the classics. So it wasn't until I actually got published that I started reading fantasy again. And people had, one of the first things they said was, you know, this is such a great change from the dark and gritty that's out there. And I'm like, what? What are you talking about?
There's dark and gritty out there?
What is dark and gritty? What, I mean, I had no idea what they're, and I'm like, I was clueless, so I started reading. And one of the things I found, Robert Jordan and Martin and some of the other new people out there, was kind of the annoying things was how they, you know, the language was bothering me because it was so stilted, it was so hard to follow.
Yeah.
That was one of the things that kind of separated me, and I like, this is really annoying, kind of how it's presented. But the other thing was the wall of information that you're hit with. And I went to the bookstore and I was flipping through each book, and I just took them down at random, and I just grabbing books off, and I would read the first page of each one. And they all started very similarly with this wall of information about in the year of the Dark Lord when the lands of Ochlocon were faced with their great, and it would go on and on. I'm like, is there a character or a story somewhere in this?
Can we get a point of view at some point? Yeah.
And it just, and then they'll start into a race and they'll explain the history of this race. And I'm like, I need a story. So actually, when I picked up, I think it was Mistborn by Sanderson. And he starts right off with the character, and I'm like, "Oh, this is interesting." And and you read like Butcher and Jim Butcher's books, and he starts right in with the character. I'm like, "Okay, this is something that I can get involved." And it's like there's been two different rule sets that if you're writing, say, a thriller, you have that kind of grab you by the throat from the very beginning and haul you into the story. But if you're writing fantasy, I guess the readers expect to spend, 150 pages just learning before you get the story going.
Yeah, the source book, yeah.
and I couldn't agree with that, because I feel that it's the writer's job to essentially capture the attention immediately and keep it. And that doesn't appear to be the tradition of modern day fantasy. And I could never understand that, because I was actually compelled when I read The Hobbit. I mean, from the very first line, you're like, a hobbit is a hole in the ground, and not a dirty sandy hole, but and I was like, this is great. I want to know more about it. And he takes you right along on this journey. And I found out that Harry Potter did do that. I mean, it suckered you in right in the beginning. And I realized that both The Hobbit and Harry Potter were YA books. Mm-hmm. And right there I went, oh, interesting, YA, short attention span, kids, yes. YA for adult would be perfect.
Definitely.
So, but I liked thrillers because they pull you in, and so I wanted to have the same thing happen. I wanted to get that same kind of immediate, grabbing your attention, giving you a mystery that you want to know the answer to with compelling characters, and then just kind of, once you get them immediately, once you get their attention, then you can kind of slack off and give them a little bit of information. Yeah. But you want to bury that in the story because you never want them to lose interest. But then you feed out little things. And a number of people have said, I don't have enough world building in the first book. And I said, but you know everything. You know the gods. You know the political system. You know the different countries. Like, well, yeah, but I don't remember reading that. Like, yeah, because I was sneaking it in. And that was the whole idea, is I would give you a little bit each time, feeding, and I repeated myself intentionally so that I knew you're not going to get it. Because like when I read George R.R. Martin's Game of Thrones, and I got to the beginning, and then you got the point where I forget who it is. He's coming to the Winterfell, and you have this whole procession of the kings and his family, and they're presented, and I think it's presented in 2 pages, where I think you meet like 12 people.
Yeah. Right.
Right after another, and it's not like his name, Bob and Harry were all there. It's a quick description of each person plus their background. Like, he expects me to remember this? And I'm like, I need a pencil.
Yeah, exactly.
I have given short expositions for the purpose of saying, okay, this is something you're going to need to know, but don't worry about it. You're not going to need to know this now. You're not going to be tested on it. You'll be tested later. I'll give you another quiz. And so, like, the whole thing with the gods, I give that to you at the beginning of, or in the middle of Crown Conspiracy, but I don't expect you to remember it. There's nothing about it. I'll bring it up again. I'll bring it up again in different languages, so that eventually when you get to the point where you need to understand what that information is, you'll have learned it and not know when you learned it. Right. And that was one of the things I was trying and struggling to do, because I don't like fighting and putting out a huge amount of effort when I read. Mm-hmm. I like the author to have done that. Yeah. Sometimes it's up to the reader to kind of figure things out, or not figure things out, but kind of fill in gaps that he doesn't fill in. And in my mind, I always felt that's like hiring someone to come paint your house, and they show up with paint and brushes and say, go ahead. I mean, it's like, as an author, I think it's my job to make it the most enjoyable and easiest reading experience possible. And that's why if I can say the same thing in 5 words that I can also say easier in a paragraph, then by eliminating all those extra words and making it less for you to have to read as a reader is what I try to do, because you shouldn't have to wade through 5 pages to get the same information I can give you in a sentence. Mm-hmm. And that makes it easier for you to grasp. It makes you, because most of the time, and I've seen this happen, I've read things that never come up in the book, or never come up to any importance in the book. And most of it is completely useless and information that you don't need. And that's what I was trying to trim out of my book. Mm-hmm. Because almost everything in my book, you'll find, has a reason. If I introduce a character, that character is going to be important later on down the line. If I spend any time at all describing them, that is going to come back again. Whereas other authors, I can't say that I actually know this for firsthand, but apparently Robert Jordan, I've heard from many people, he continually introduces more and more characters who just show up and then leave, and you never see them again. And like I said, I don't know if that's true or not, but that's the impression I've gotten. And I actually have the opposite, because if I take the time to create a character, it's easier for me to just reuse the same characters again. Why invent a new one and have to go through all the effort of creating a character when I can just use an old one again? And if I need him to do something different, that's even better, because then that character gets to grow, become something different, and they transition. So you have a complex weave. You have a tapestry that is very complex, because you're using the same places and the same characters. Like when I read Harry Potter stories, I love the fact that you kind of use the same settings over and over again, to the point where you became familiar with them. She didn't have to waste a lot of time describing them, because you already knew them. And instead of describing what you already knew, she described new things to add on to it. So each time it got thicker and deeper and more rich, such that, you knew about 5 things before, now you know about 10, now you know about 15 on top of that. So the world is like, it's really deep. And I was trying to do that same kind of thing with my books, where I keep reusing the same people in the same places and weaving them back and forth until you get this very tight weave where you know everyone there. It's like your family. And you know that, oh my God, when he finds out about this, you know what's going to happen.
Yeah.
And that kind of effect is built up. It's almost like a soap opera effect, where you know the characters and you believe in them so much that you know what their reactions are going to be when this happens. And that makes it much richer and much more emotionally investing for most people reading it.
Nice.
Okay. Do you find yourself like going back and changing things in like chapters way before the development actually takes place?
Well, interesting enough, when I wrote The Crown Conspiracy and Avampartha, I wrote The Crown Conspiracy in August, and I wrote Avampartha in September. And I wrote each book in a month. And so I did them very quickly. And I kind of wrote them right off the top of my head. I didn't really think about them. And how I wrote those books originally is pretty much how they ended up. I made some changes because I had some plot holes that I had to fix. Because when I got to the end, I'm like, oh, yeah, I forgot. I changed that. So I have to go back and I just would insert a sentence or two, or take a sentence out. And then so that everything made sense, because obviously I was going to change some stuff. And I would just go click, 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 and now it's done. And that was the rough draft. And mostly my rough drafts are like 95% of how the thing's going to go out. So I don't really rewrite ever, unless I don't understand the term rewrite. Because to me, to rewrite is to start over from scratch and rewrite the whole thing once you know where it's going. I don't do that. I do some light editing passes, where I'll go through and I'll see how the pacing goes. And it got really slow here. Let's change that. It's running too fast here. I need more description to kind of slow it down a little bit to make it nice, even pacing. And I'll do that, and I'll find errors and I'll fix those. But other than that, that's all I ever do. So it's kind of a very quick rough draft, which really comes off the top of my head. Now, lately, I've changed my writing style a little bit, to where now what I do is I take one of these Moleskine notebooks with me. And every Wednesday I'll go to a coffee shop.
I have those too.
Because it keeps me awake. If I sit at home and I think, because what I did was how I started making up stories is I would do it when I went to bed at night as a kid, and I would daydream, and it always put me to sleep. So the same thing happens today. If I start daydreaming, I get sleepy. But if I go to a coffee shop, the combination of caffeine and people moving around me keeps me awake. And I will just sit there and I will fantasize in my head the scene. And as I come up with information, I'll go, oh yeah, he could do this, and that would be so cool because he would do that. I'll jot those down as notes. I'm not writing, I'm just jotting notes down. And then I take those notes home, and then every morning when I write, I'll reference the notes, and I'll go through and write it up for real. Because I can't write except in a very quiet environment where no one's bothering me. But when I'm brainstorming, I can do it while driving, I can do it while walking, I'll do it while listening to music, I'll do it while I'm at a coffee shop. I just come up with ideas, and I'll just kind of fantasize that scene in my head as much as I can. And I'll come up with the cool things, the really neat stuff, the lines of dialogue that are going to be really funny, the lines of events that I think are going to be really exciting for people to hear. And then I'll go down and I'll write out the rest of it, and I'll put it all together. And the bulk of the stuff happens when I'm actually writing. And sometimes things get changed, but for the most part, that's kind of the process I go through to day-to-day writing.
Uncle, it's difficult because I find if I have to go somewhere not in my place to actually write. Otherwise, if I have distractions, then my brain's not going to work. I need that quiet place.
Yeah, but that's what happens when I'm writing. But when I'm actually thinking things up, a great method I've discovered is that you can't. I find it hard to just think. You need to have it's like you have a fountain pen. In order to get the thing to write the first time, you need to put like a little water on it, so it like makes this conduit and this catalyst, and it starts bringing the ink out. So what I actually have done to get my mind flowing is, well, I'll go for a walk in the woods away from people. It's very important to remind you of that part. So that when I go walking, what I'll actually do is I'll have conversations out loud with myself, where I will tell myself, as if I'm another person, what my book's about. And I'll just begin by saying, okay, so there's these two thieves, and they go up to this tower, and I'll think to myself, I'll imagine the other person say, well, what kind of tower? Well, it's a stone tower. How tall is it? Okay, so it's 5 stories. And I have these conversations where I work out the problems. And I immediately logically click in my head and ask the obvious questions that, they got to the chapel to go in to get the sword. Was the door locked? Yeah. How'd they get it open? Oh, crap. Okay. And then I'll have to think of something new. And that's how I work out a lot of the problems. And I'm not the only one who does that, because apparently I just got done reading On Writing by Stephen King, where he had a problem with the book The Stand that he wrote. And he did the same thing. He would just go for walks and try and work out these problems. I don't know if he talked to himself. That may be unique just to me.
Who else does that is Kevin J. Anderson. I think he just took over the Dune series.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and he basically writes his whole book while he's out hiking in the mountains. Yeah. With like a little, like I think now he has like an iPhone, and he'll put the headphones in with a little microphone on them, and he'll just kind of dictate the book into the thing, and then he brings it home, and his wife transcribes it.
Wow, no, I couldn't do that. Yeah. I actually had to sit and write.
Yeah, me too. And if I were mountain climbing or hiking a mountain or something, most of my books would be very short. And it would just be like, okay, so this guy says, ah! And I fall off the mountain.
No, I need something I can jack directly into my brain so that I can actually bring it out in video and on audio, because I can visualize the scenes very well, and then I have to figure out how to break those down into actual words.
Nice.
Oh yeah, that's that's difficult, because sometimes I see something in my head and it just doesn't translate. Like, well, what sort of expression? This is a very specific expression I'm thinking of. Can you name it? No. So yeah.
Yeah, I've had a lot of people ask me that. It's like, how do I describe the fact that he's smiling if I've done it already?
Yeah.
Or how do you say this without saying it over and over again? I'm like, well, you have to come up with different ways to do it.
Yeah, you can only say he smiled so many times
right.
before you say, like, oh,
he nodded,
his
he smiled,
lips turned up slightly at the sides.
He created the expression the opposite of frowning. Oh wait, yes. What?
Yeah. And I wanted to know, do you do like the outlining, like plan everything in advance, or do you do more of a like discovery, like you have the end in mind and then you kind of write up towards that end and just can figure it out as you go along?
Oh, it's kind of interesting, because this is the one thing that I disagreed with in Stephen King's outline, or On Writing. He talked about he doesn't like outlining because he says he doesn't trust plots, but I think we have a difference of opinion of the definition of the word plot. I think when he thinks of it, he thinks of story. He likes story because he thinks story is like the characters and the story and the setting all together. But plot to him, I think, is just the events, and he feels that it needs to be subordinate to the rest of the story. Whereas in my mind, I see plot as the same exact word as story, except when applied to a written novel or a movie. That the plot is story, but it's only when you apply it to an actual written or conceived work that it becomes plot. So because I can't imagine telling someone a plot of a story without also including the dialogue or the characters and the setting, because it wouldn't make sense. So I'm not sure. There might be a semantics problem there, but as far as I'm concerned, when I do it, it's both. I don't think you can do one or the other. And I was kind of just speaking about how I write a general outline. I don't actually write a general outline. I come up with an idea. And then I start thinking about that idea. And I think of scenes. I think of where I kind of want it to go, where I want it to begin. And I keep adding to that. And just general fantasizing, just general thinking it up in my head. And when I get to the point where I can't keep it all in my head, where I start, forgetting things, then I start jotting down notes. Yeah. That becomes my outline. And I keep, so I say, okay, now you're going to do this, you're going to do this, and I keep that as an outline. And then I always want to know, and this is extremely important, I need to know where it begins, and I need to know where it's going to end. Nice to know something about what happens in the middle, but really I need to know where it's going to end, because too many times I used to write without outlining, and I would get halfway or three-quarters of the way through the story and then realize I can't end it because I don't have an ending.
Huh.
And that just wastes an enormous amount of time. I mean, I would take a year to write a book, and I would get 8 months into it and realize I've just wasted all my time. That I either have to rewrite the whole thing from scratch, or I have to rip out half the book, and all that time is lost. And I got very frustrated. So when I really started getting serious about writing, when I started actually trying to get published, I thought this is a huge waste of time that I cannot afford to do. So to save myself that trouble, I always make sure that I know how to get from the beginning to the end. So I start writing it with an idea that I'm going to go in this direction. But as soon as I go in that direction, like all great plans, once put into action, they fall apart. Mm-hmm. Because once you know your characters, as I was just explaining, that they end up taking you in places that you had not expected to go to, because you know how they're going to react when you put them in a situation, and that may not be the way you need them to go for the plot. But in order to stay true to your characters, you have to let them go where they want. Mm-hmm. So then you break off the plot. Now you're in a totally different direction. And once I do that, once I realize they're going to go left instead of right, I have to say, okay, if they go left, how do I get them to the end? Can I still get them there? If I change this and this, I can. Okay, boom, and I've just changed the outline, and now I can go in that direction. Go a little bit further, boom, a new character is invented by sheer accident. I mean, there was a waitress who came to the table, and she had a really cool accent, and they really liked her, and suddenly she's now a new character. And she's going to go along with them. How does that affect it? Now, can I keep her in it and bring me right to the same ending? And as long as I continually recorrect so that it can always get to the end, I know I'm safe. So that's my outlining. I will have a general idea. I'll let the story go where, but I have to constantly make sure I can see a light at the end of the tunnel. Otherwise, I can get to a situation where I won't be able to finish. And that's actually one of the problems I have with Stephen King, is that, I mean, I love him as a writer, but most of his endings are bad. They're always a letdown due to the fact that he is such a great writer at suspense. He builds up your expectations so high that the endings usually don't satisfy, except for like the Shawshank Redemption and a few others that he did a really great job with. But most of his endings I've never been satisfied with, and I think it's because he doesn't know what his ending is going to be until he gets there. And that's always been one issue I had with him, and I think maybe it has to do with the fact he doesn't outline. Yeah. But in his opinion, he feels that it kills the story. It feels that the early portion of it is not going to be as vibrant and alive if you're regimented to straitjacket into doing these certain sets of things. You won't let it breathe. And I think that it's actually the best way of doing it. Certainly the best way I feel of doing it for myself is to do a balance of both.
That's great. Yeah, I like that. The balancing is because you can, you know where you're going, but you can take a little, take a little leeway from that if you need to.
Because so many people will write and they will constantly get halfway through a book and then stop because they don't know where to go next. And not knowing where to go next can be very depressing, because you'll be writing along and because there's always a point in a book where you start to lose interest and you start thinking of other ideas. And if you get to that point, you're saying to yourself, well, I really don't know where I'm going. I don't think this book is all that good. You start having all these doubts come in, and you just and it's so easy to stop. But if you know, particularly if you're in a bad spot, if you're in a dull spot, if you know that the next chapter is going to kick ass, then you'll force yourself through that dull spot to get to that fun part. And this is another problem I have, is a lot of people write out of order. Do you write out of order, or do you write...
Well, I see what you're saying about the waiting for the next chapter, because we are at that point. It's kind of... what
we've been repeating a lot of adjectives in order to try to try to speed this up to get to the fun part.
To get to the fun part. Well, that was the whole point, was that if you cherry pick and write all the good parts, as I know people have done, to me it's like eating all the marshmallows out of a box of Lucky Charms. No one ever finishes the box because there's nothing there. I mean, all it is the drab part, and you're never going to work through that. So if you write it in order, then you get a situation where you can get past the dull spots and into the exciting spots. And then, of course, if they're dull, you should try to just do something to make sure they're not dull, of course. Although many times I've written what I thought was just terrible stuff, and I just forced myself on just force myself to sit down and write, a paragraph at a time to just get through this horrendous section so I could get to the next spot. And I knew it was terrible. I'll get back to it. I'll fix it in the second pass. And then I'll go back to it. I'm like, this is really good. What was I thinking? And you don't realize it when you're doing it, but it comes out, and you're like, wow, this is actually better than the stuff I thought was going to be good. And you don't even realize it. So it sometimes your own misconceptions about your own work can really mess you up.
Yeah. Now I think we're at a good time.
Okay.
But before we do that, do you have anything? Well, I know people can find you on. Well, your website's changed recently, hasn't it? The address.
I believe it's just Ryura.com.
Yes.
And of course, no one knows how to spell that. But right now it's www. It's RIYRIA. Ryura. For those of you who don't know how to pronounce it, Ryura.com. But now you do, so we've corrected that.
And do you have anything that's slated to come out soon, or anything that you're working on right now that'll be in the near future?
I'm working on 3 different novels at the moment. One is a urban contemporary fantasy, which has nothing to do with the other books. It's actually the very first book that I ever tried to get published, which I've completely rewritten from the ground up. So that I did over the summer. And I have another 2 books at the moment that I'm working on that will be taking place in the world of Elan of Royce and Hadrian, but they're not a sequel. So if you're looking for a sequel, you're not going to be getting that. But this could be. There's been a lot of interest in people wanting to see prequels.
Yeah.
And things like, because my wife mostly, she's the one who got done, and she was very depressed when she finished reading the books because it was all over and she didn't have any more Royce and Hadrian. And one day she said to me, "Oh my God," she goes, "this is so not fair." And I said, "What isn't?" And she says, "You can always have them as friends, but I can never see them again." Yeah. So she wanted me to write, Royce and Hadrian the early years, so you get to see things like situations that were only hinted at in the other books, which is like when they first met and how they got together and those kinds of things. So that's kind of what I've been playing around with to see if I could put together a couple books based off of that period.
That's great. Yeah, because I felt that same way at the end. I was like, when you finish a series, especially, really good series, it's like, wow, everything was like so wrapped up at the end, and everything is, satisfying at the end, but it's the end.
Yeah. Yeah, it's always kind of depressing. And then, of course, when I originally wrote the series, I'm sitting alone in my bedroom, and no one has ever read my stuff, and I knew I was never going to get published, but weirdly enough, in the back of my mind, I have this strange sort of arrogance to think, what if maybe it got really popular and people wanted to actually read it and read more? What could I do? Could I, build off of this? So I actually have ideas such as, there could be a whole trilogy of explaining the history of Navran.
Yeah.
There's some stuff that's not being told.
Again, no spoilers, nothing specific, but that's one of the big things.
So even though you even still don't know even a small smidgen of that story, because what actually happened back then was completely different than what the myth has become that now the people in the world that in the series believe in. So that would be an interesting story to write, just because it is so drastically different than what people thought or think at this moment. So it would be interesting to tell how he came to be who he was. So that would be an interesting story to follow. And the other one would be Ezra Haddon and Jerish, and how the empire fell and how they got the heir out. And so that would be the other story that would be compelling.
Yeah, because that's another little seed that was planted,
right?
With the dream sequences.
Exactly. So, and those take place very far apart. I mean, one's like 3,000 years ago, one's 1,000 years ago, and so that kind of thing. I could use those to be able to write completely different stories about completely different characters, and yet in the same world, and hopefully be able to still attract the same audience and be able to sell the books. In other words, because I would love to be able to write a whole bunch of other kinds of books, because like I said, I've written mysteries and science fiction and fantasies and contemporary, coming of age stories. But once you get published, you realize that in order to continue to make money to live off of, you have to make sure you put something out that's commercially viable. And in that instance, I think most of the people would be more interested in buying books that are about Royce and Hadrian than, say, independent standalone books that have nothing to do with it.
Great. So it's Riyria, Riyyria, and you can just search that and find out everything that's going on. And I gotta say,
everything that you need to know in the world. Yes, basically
everything.
Only the important stuff is there.
And I think I had a lot of fun with this doing the interview, and I thank you for coming on. If I didn't mention before, I really did enjoy the series, and I have been dreading doing this interview because I was like, oh man, all I'm gonna do is just be like, oh, so remember when that happened? That was really cool, wasn't it? Like in the book.
You did not gush nearly enough.
Oh, well, I'll have to just kind of edit some of me saying like, so remember when Royce pulled out his dagger the first time? Yeah, that was cool, wasn't it? I really did. I thank you for taking the time to talk to us, and thank you for putting your stories out there because they're a lot of fun to read.
Well, thank you, and for inviting me here. This was fun.